if I'm struggling in relationships with men and I keep on feeling really uncomfortable around men and I have all these issues, it might be worth being curious about, well, what would it be like to work with a male therapist? Mm-hmm. Would it bring up some discomfort? Perhaps, but then how could I use this relationship to kind of figure out how to be more comfortable, how to work through some of these issues? Welcome to LOVELINK, your guide to love and connection in all forms. We are your hosts, Signe and Simone and Simone Humphrey. So hi, Signe.
Hi, Simone.
Nice to see you.
You too.
So let's jump right in and talk about how to find a therapist. This is a question that we get all the time from our friends, from our listeners, and it can be a really daunting process.
Yeah. So maybe we should start with the question of, should you go to therapy? Right?
Yeah.
I think that's sort of a question a lot of people, I get that a lot. People asking like, well, I'm thinking about it, but I'm not sure if my issues or my circumstances really justify therapy, or maybe I should wait or hold off. Right. So some advice that I always give is that, therapy doesn't have to be about tackling a particular, one particular issue or a particular crisis, but it can be also about just self-improvement.
Yeah. Self-potential.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think so often people do come to therapy in crisis, whether that's crisis in your personal life and you're looking for individual therapy, or we get a lot of couples that often come in crisis. And that's a really important time to go to therapy. Yes, I would absolutely encourage people who are in crisis to come to therapy. But it's really helpful when you have someone that comes in before the crisis even begins. When you have a couple that's starting to have difficulties and challenges, but they're still early enough in their relationship or early enough in their issues that they're still really motivated, or a person who's dealing with some kind of life struggles, but they're on their way to a crisis. This can really be a preventative approach if you catch it on the front end. So if you're ambivalent because or uncertain because you're not sure if your problems warrant therapy, I would say come in, see what it's like, and start exploring this early so it doesn't escalate into something bigger.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and especially with couples, I'll just echo that. It's so nice when a couple comes in before the crisis, when they're just working through. All couples fight, all couples have difficulties, and they're just beginning to work through that, because it prevents a lot of escalation of conflict down the line.
Yeah, and I think something that a lot of patients are concerned about is, when do I end therapy, or if I start therapy, am I going to be in therapy forever? And I feel like this is important to say for the record that people come and go. You can come to therapy and get a lot out of it and then feel like, all right, maybe my work here is done, or the sessions feel a little flat, and you can leave therapy and then come back to it. So it's not a commitment that's forever, and you and your therapist can work on what you want to accomplish and then decide together when it's a good time to end.
Yeah, and it's a good question to ask therapists up front. How long do you typically work with clients?
Yeah.
Just to get a sense of if they have a timeline.
Yeah.
So what are the different types of therapy? There's individual therapy, couples and family therapy, and group therapy. I think those are like the big three.
Yeah. And the way I kind of think about these different contexts, individual therapy, I think of much more, it goes really deep into that person's personal life, oftentimes into their history, really focuses on their relationship to the world, themes that are coming up in their life. Couples therapy, if all you're talking about in your individual therapy, or all you're talking about as a presenting problem is your relationship, couples therapy is ideal because you have both partners in the room. The therapist can really see what's happening in the dynamic between you and your partner. And then how would you define group therapy, or how would you recommend someone for group therapy?
That's a good question. Well, first of all, I love group therapy because I feel like it's almost like therapy on crack. Like people get so much out of group therapy because I'm, there are different types of group therapy. So sometimes people are coming in because of a specific issue like eating disorders. And then it's like there's an eating disorder support group or skills group. But a lot of the time when I think about group therapy, I also think about interpersonal group therapy, where it's more about building an awareness of how you are in relation to other people through the process of being in a weekly 90-minute group. So the group can provide support. The group can also provide a space where you get really honest feedback from other members about how they experience you. It provides a space for experimenting with being more transparent about how you feel, an opportunity to put words to how you feel. So it's really about building relational awareness, but also receiving support at the same time.
That's a nice way to put it. And I think that group therapy, we've talked about this both from our personal experiences, that it can be really triggering and it can it can bring up a lot. And having conjunctive individual therapy is something sometimes really helpful, so that you're not only talking about what's happening in the group with the group, but then having your own supportive space to really deepen that exploration of what just happened in the group. Why did I get so angry or so sad? Because emotions often tend to be heightened in groups.
Yeah. No, I mean, in group, I've never felt so much like shame and anger and sadness and all of these emotions come up regularly.
Totally.
Whereas a little different with an individual therapist, because it's just like you and the therapist, and it's about your relationship with the therapist sometimes, but mainly it's focused on you and the therapist providing you with support, versus in a group, you're all in the experience together.
Yeah. It's a little more activating.
Yeah.
So therapy is such a weird thing. Every once in a while, I go on a vacation or I'm taken myself out of context, and I'm like, what the hell is therapy? Like, what do we do? We're two people in a room talking to each other, and it can be really hard to define and evaluate. So let's talk about what therapy is and what that process looks like.
Yeah, it's a good question. I ask myself that all the time as well, because it can mean a lot of different things, I think. When I think about therapy, one way of thinking about it is like coming in with a specific issue that's emotional, psychological in nature, that's causing a lot of distress that you want to, process and resolve. Like, that's kind of what I think a lot of people associate with therapy, and that can certainly be part of it. But sort of broadly, it's like managing symptoms, identifying feelings, identifying, how your past relates to your present, sort of in general, like building self-awareness, both awareness of yourself, but also awareness of yourself in relation to another person.
Right. It's sort of like a space that feels really protected, that hopefully feels really safe and allows the person to heal and grow. Mm-hmm. And you have this person who's an expert, not on you, because you're the only expert on your life, but an expert in how to process some of these things that often we have been raised to shut down our feelings, write over what we want, not have access to all of these parts of our inner world. And I think therapy is really a space where it allows sort of you to both feel, but also kind of identify what you want in your life, and being able to see how all of these barriers have gotten in the way, whether that's with certain relationships or certain ways that you relate to yourself. So being able to understand the kind of themes in your life. Like, are you the type of person that chooses partners who leave very quickly? Or are you someone who seems to get into conflict all the time? So really understanding like how these different patterns in your relationships? Or are you someone who gets fired all the time? And really being able to understand it and connect it to how you developed it in the first place.
Yeah, and I think about, related to that, like when things are out of awareness, when our relational patterns or our feelings or our defenses remain out of awareness, they have a tremendous amount of power over us. But when we're able to bring them to the surface, then we can have, choice about how we choose to relate to ourselves and the world around us, versus just kind of being in our default state, our default mode. Right.
It's sort of, I love that. Empowering people to have choice in their life, to make conscious decisions, and to trust themselves too. To be able to trust your intuition, trust your emotions, kind of honor yourself. That can be really difficult for many people.
Yeah. And then couples therapy, family therapy, and group therapy does some of that work around building self-awareness and allowing people to have more choice through awareness, but also becomes very much about how experimenting with or practicing relating differently. Yeah. So it becomes more about building the capacity to connect and be vulnerable.
Yeah. And so different therapists are trained in a million different models, and it makes no sense for us to go through them. Although we try to put together a short list on our website at lovelink.co of the kind of most popular forms of individual therapy and the most popular forms of couples therapy. But really, I think if we're going to kind of pare it down into something very, very basic, you kind of have two different types of therapists. Those that tend to be very behavioral, coming up with much more kind of skill-based strategies to target present-focused problems, known as cognitive behavioral therapists. And then you have the camp of therapists that really try to unpack history, go back to childhood experiences to understand how you are in the present. And this is considered psychodynamic therapy. So there's a range of therapies in between, but these are sort of the basic models.
Right. And some therapists are pretty direct and active, and others are more passive, more neutral, and kind of allow things to unfold more. So, you kind of have to feel out what style resonates with you when you pick a therapist.
And you may not know this initially. You can look at their website and you get a description and you maybe have a sense of how they work as they describe it. But if you start to look at therapist bios, they all start to sound exactly the same. And if you look at specialties, some people have really specific specialties. And actually, I think that's a really good sign that they are an expert in that. But most therapists have 10 or 20 specialties, which means they're more general practitioners. So a lot of finding a therapist is figuring out a good fit, figuring out what feels good, what works for you.
Yeah. So
like important.
Dating. It's kind of like dating. Yeah, totally. And you might have to go on some bad first dates to find your person.
Yes. Or even just date around. Even if you have a good date, maybe you want another good date and then choose between the two therapists.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about how to find a therapist.
Yeah. Because that is certainly tricky. And a lot of it depends on your financial resources and whether you have insurance or not.
Yeah. So, I guess with insurance, a lot of therapists, at least in New York City, I don't think this is true across the country, but in New York City, a lot of therapists are out of network. So that means you have to pay out of pocket. And then if you have insurance that has out of network benefits, they'll cover usually a portion of the fee. But then there are a lot of therapists too that are in network. So certainly contacting your insurance company to see who is in network for them would be one strategy to find a therapist.
And one of the ways that you can filter out people that are in network is either through your insurance company, through their search engine, or Psychology Today is a great way to do a therapist search and then filter out which insurance company they accept.
So then there are also training clinics that provide sliding scale that you can find. Like in New York City, there's so many. I mean, we could spend hours talking about all the different training clinics and the different models that they use. Then there are websites that are national, like Psychology Today provides a good overview of therapists in different cities and what insurances they take and what their fees look like. Other, I mean, I think the best way to find a therapist is through a referral.
Yes, definitely. That should be a first line. You may not have someone that knows anyone, and then you can go back to these search engines, but it's always better to have a higher filter by asking someone you know if they have a recommendation. Whether you have a friend who's a therapist or a psychiatrist, your primary doctor may know psychologists that they would recommend. If you're part of a school counseling clinic, you can always see someone there, but if they only see patients short term, they often have a list of therapists that they provide for referrals. Or your friends. If your friend had a really good experience in therapy and they say, I love my therapist, go see if that therapist is willing to see you.
Yeah. That's the best way, for sure.
Yes.
Because then they're vetted.
They're vetted. Right. Because there's a lot of therapists out there, and some therapists are really good. And then you hear a lot of horror stories. Sadly, I've had patients who have come to my office after several experiences that were really negative, where the therapist didn't seem like they cared, or at worst, one therapist who kind of fell asleep.
Oh my God. I've heard that from clients too, that they've seen a therapist that fell asleep. I was like, how is that possible?
Yes. Or a therapist who's late, or someone you go to their office and their office is a mess. I mean, when you pick up on these red flags and you hear your intuition and you say, like, this isn't a good fit, listen to it. And find someone that you really trust, because you are going to be opening up in the most vulnerable of ways to this person. This is a real relationship in your life.
Although there was one time where I referred Simone to someone who I was seeing, who I actually liked, but then it was a bad experience.
Oh my God! Yeah, because he forgot my name. He kept on calling me Nicole, over and over again. And then, he missed a session that we had scheduled. He just completely didn't show, and then apologized in an email by calling me Nicole. And
oh my God, it's terrible. Yeah, I stopped seeing him after that, actually, because I was like, if you're treating other people like that, like I can't.
You couldn't get over that.
No, I couldn't get over that. No.
Yeah. And then some of the things that are helpful to keep in mind when you're searching for a therapist is like, what's your type? Like, are you looking for someone that's older and wiser? Are you looking for someone that's younger and can relate? Is there a specific race, sexuality, or gender that you might feel more comfortable with? So I think asking these questions ahead of time, and it's not necessarily, it doesn't mean that who you want to work with is necessarily the best fit. I think oftentimes people feel safer with a particular person, but actually could really benefit from working through their discomfort with another type of person. But asking yourselves these questions, if I'm struggling in relationships with men and I keep on feeling really uncomfortable around men and I have all these issues, it might be worth being curious about, well, what would it be like to work with a male therapist? Would it bring up some discomfort? Perhaps, but then how could I use this relationship to kind of figure out how to be more comfortable, how to work through some of these issues?
So important.
Yeah.
So if we think about the steps, like once you find a person that seems interesting, like a clinician who you're curious about working with, and usually it's good to have like 3 of those, perhaps. Again, back to this like dating analogy, like it's good to try a few different people before making your choice, but reach out to that therapist. And then see if they're willing to do, a brief phone call at minimum. Sometimes therapists are willing to do a full consultation session, and so you can get a sense of their style.
Yeah, most therapists, I would say, provide a 15-minute consultation where they ask you what you're looking for in therapy, and you can ask questions of the therapist, but a kind of being able to touch base and see if it's going to work.
And then some good questions to ask are about like their policies, cancellation, costs, insurance, if they increase their rates annually, how they work, do they have experience with the problem that you're coming in with, what's their training and expertise. Are they licensed? Hopefully they're licensed. And just a thing on training and expertise, there are psychiatrists. The psychiatrists are medical professionals, medical doctors who can prescribe medication and sometimes are also trained in providing therapy. And we have doctoral level clinicians who have PhDs or PsyDs. So they have, 6 to 8 years of graduate school training. And PsyDs and PhDs have to write a dissertation and do research. And then master's level clinicians, usually social workers or mental health counselors. And then coaches. But coaches, being a coach is not a protected title. So you have to ask a little bit more about what training that person actually has, because it's not a title where they need to be licensed. Yeah.
And coaches tend to be more present focused, more direct, more advice giving. And that's a generalization, but that they tend to target specific problems like finding a partner or getting a job, and can be a lot more practical in the ways that they approach problems.
I'm curious, how have you just once you sit with a therapist, how do you decide whether they're a good fit for you? What are some of the things?
That's a good question. A lot of it is how comfortable I am. Does this person put me at ease? It's so, there's the part of me that wants to find the smartest therapist. Can this person tell me exactly what I'm struggling with and why, and kind of lay out this beautiful kind of interpretation and analysis. That's sort of on a cognitive level. But when I'm actually in the room with a therapist, so much of it is just, how do they make me feel?
Yeah.
Do I feel at ease with this person? Do they make me feel safe? Do I feel unjudged? And it's like those basics that allows me to say, yes, I want to see this person again.
Yeah, I would say this. Yeah, I think the same thing. Do I feel comfortable with them, and do they offer me something in the first session? Do I feel like I walk away with a little bit of a sense of what they could offer me, so that it's not just a session where I feel supported and empathized and validated, but do I get a little something, or do I walk away having a slightly different perspective or some insight or something?
Right. A little piece of how they work.
Yeah.
And how they could be helpful.
Right. But I agree. So much of it is chemistry and just gut intuition about comfort level. Yeah. And then I think, just on a very practical level, I did see a therapist once who I loved. I had such a good session, but she was $350. It just financially was I couldn't, it was such a stretch that I felt I would start to become eventually resentful of the therapy. Yeah. So I think, there's sometimes also things like location and affordability. Will I become resentful in the long term if it's not convenient enough and not within my budget?
Yeah, convenience is huge. Now we have teletherapy, which I think a lot of patients are going to want to continue even when we go back to in-person therapy, because they can just squeeze it into their day. But when we were going into the office, it really was about, can this be a part of my commute?
Yeah.
Do I have to make an hour out of my way to go for an hour an appointment? Just doesn't really work in my schedule. And hopefully you're in a place that has enough therapists that you can choose someone that's closer.
Yeah. Right. So sometimes it's good to think of also when you're with a therapist for the first time, like, what are some red flags where...
Yeah, there's a lot of them.
I mean, there's a lot, yeah.
The most egregious, and it's so sad to say this because it happens, is when therapists hit on you.
Yes. They flirt with you. Yeah.
When they flirt with you, and we know that it happens every year. I'm sure many times, I don't know what the exact statistics are, but it's the number one ethical violation that psychologists breach, which is having sex with their clients.
Yeah, well, and mostly it's men, but as a side note.
Men with younger women.
Yeah.
Yes.
Classic tale. Yeah, but that is that's a huge red flag.
Yeah, that's a hard no. That's hopefully a clear no to most people. But sometimes, it can just be something subtle. Like the therapist touches you and it doesn't feel right. Or the therapist emails you or texts you and it doesn't feel like a boundary that feels appropriate.
They comment on what you're wearing.
Yeah.
Stuff like that is important to pay attention to.
Yeah.
Showing up late to an appointment or canceling frequently, those are obviously red flags. Or forgetting your name.
Oh God.
That's terrible.
God. Also bad advice. I get this a lot from patients who have been with other therapists, and they report back to me what their therapist might have said to them or told them to do. And of course I always take it with a grain of salt. Like how much of it is my patient interpreting something that was taken out of context. So I have a friend who went to a therapist, and he was sharing with her that he was struggling a lot in his marriage, and he wasn't sure what to do, and he felt really stuck. And she encouraged him to have an affair.
Yeah, like that's fucked up.
And yeah, right, exactly. So, it's things like that feel like they're either not processed enough, or they're said flippantly, or it's advice that could really harm them.
Yeah. Yeah. It's one thing to say, hey, have you and your partner talked about having an open relationship? Sometimes people find that helpful. What do you feel as I'm sharing this, possibility with you, or this way of structuring a relationship, blah, blah, unpacking that. That's very different than saying like, oh, you should have an affair. Like that.
Yes.
That's not helpful. I know
Absolutely.
who you're talking about.
I know you do.
Yeah.
And then also forcing you to talk about something that you feel really uncomfortable talking about.
Yeah.
Or a really big trauma in your life, and the therapist says something like, you need to talk about this and there's not another option.
Yeah.
It might be encouraged. A therapist might want to push you, but also there should be a space that really at least builds up to that place. Understand what makes it really difficult to share, providing you with coping tools so that if and when you do share, that you feel safe and comfortable. If they're pushing you and not really talking it through with you, that's a red flag.
Yeah. Yeah, not really processing, well, what is making this difficult to share?
Yeah. Yeah.
Any kind of anger or defensiveness, if you give the therapist feedback, therapists should be able, be trained to take feedback. It's an important part of the process that a client can be open about, whether if the therapist is misattuned in some way or said something that landed in a bad way.
Yeah. And also, like all people, therapists can burn out.
Yeah.
And a burnt out therapist is not a therapist that you want to be with, because they're not effective. They should be not only taking care of themselves to prevent burnout, but they should be engaged.
And I also feel like the way, this may sound superficial, but like the way a therapist is dressed or how their office looks can be an indicator of, where they're at emotionally. So if a therapist is like very disheveled or very disorganized in their office or in their appearance, that usually to me is a red flag.
Yeah. The office is a special sacred place that the patient should feel at ease, should feel calm. And having a cluttered office that's really disorganized and there's papers all over the place, like isn't a place where you feel less stress.
Yeah.
And so an environment that allows a person to feel at ease is really important.
Yeah. So in general, I think it's about like finding somebody who you feel comfortable with, who's comfortable receiving feedback, who you feel is curious about you, is non-judgmental, is warm, somebody centered in themselves. I don't know, like I think so much of it is really honestly going off gut intuition about how you experience, how the therapist makes you feel. Like just really paying attention to how the therapist makes you feel. And, you know, sometimes, like you said, like it can take a while to really know what a therapist is like. You know, like, so you may have a good first impression, but then after like 3 or 4 sessions, you're like, I don't know, this isn't the right thing. Or the reverse can happen where you're kind of ambivalent, but you go back and then actually something opens up and you feel comfortable and it feels like it could potentially be a really good working relationship. But the important thing to know is like you can see a therapist for however many times and then say, this is not for me. Like you're not, you have to feel stuck. Don't feel stuck with anybody.
No, or obligated to see someone because you don't want to hurt their feelings.
Yeah.
Because therapy is really about you. And you should feel like you're getting something from it. I mean, it's wonderful to have a safe space where you feel unjudged, but it's expensive. And no one wants to spend $250 to just vent. I mean, some people might, but to not feel like you're growing.
Yeah.
And therapy should also be a place of growth. And so to be able to talk about or at least reflect on, are there shifts inside me? Are there shifts in my relationships? Are there shifts in my life in some way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's hard to find a good therapist that you connect with.
It is hard. It is hard. And we encourage people, I mean, we're based in New York City, but if you have questions or if you need a referral, you're welcome to reach out to info@lovelink.co. We'd be happy to help you find someone.
Yeah, we have lists of people that we really like and that we trust.
Yes.
So don't hesitate.
Yeah, and we may be accepting patients too.
Maybe.
This is such a big topic, and we really wanted to condense it down into a little nugget. So, you know, this is kind of the quick and dirty, but again, yeah, if you have questions, let us know. This podcast kind of came as a result of people asking us. So continue with your questions, and you know, if we miss anything or need to follow up, we'll include it in our next podcast.
Yeah, and feel free to also reach out with any other topics you would like us to spend some time talking about. Bye, Simone.
All right, Signe. Bye.
Mm-hmm.